coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, we're here today to debate a bill. Thank you. We're here today to debate a bill that is precipitated by the fact that the Liberals decided to not challenge a lower court ruling which would allow unfettered citizenship by descent, create untold, like the department doesn't even know how many, citizens of convenience. And we're now on third reading of this bill, wherein the government decided to gut amendments passed by the committee, which would have required basic things like language requirements, cumulative residency requirements, security checks, and they gutted it. After not challenging a court ruling, they gutted these amendments, which were common sense. Even the Globe and Mail colleagues said that the amendment we put in place was common sense and that the government should have worked and accepted the Conservative and Bloc amendment with regard to the residency requirement. Even the Globe and Mail said this, and yet we have, just the parliamentary secretary, his comments were so rote and kind of feckless, frankly. And I want to tell you why. This bill deals fundamentally with the value of Canadian citizenship. And the reason why I can't support this bill, particularly without those amendments, is because without national identity, integration is impossible and the collapse of our country is inevitable. And I want to lay this out and why we need to have more value on Canadian citizenship and why this bill so denigrates Canadian citizenship, why it's going to create citizens of convenience that some future parliament is going to have to deal with. Mark my words, to the bureaucrats that are listening in the lobby, to future courts that will be dealing with this, future ministers that will be looking at evacuations from some country. This bill creates citizenship of convenience. It takes away the notion of responsibility from citizenship, and it will impact our country absolutely in the future. Okay. So what is Canada's national identity? Colleagues, ahead of every election, I try to find the reason why I would run again, to ground myself in that purpose. Because for all of us of all political stripe, running has, it's such an honorable thing to do, but it also comes with a cost to our families. And I took my family to a visit, an art installation at the National Gallery. It's a visual art installation by Thomas Tallis's Spem and Allium, and it's this speaker setup. And when you sit in the middle of this installation, this is what I tried to convince or explain to my family. This is why I was running, because when Canada, when our pluralism, the democratic institutions of our pluralism are upheld, Canada is a unique, beautiful thing in our history. It has all of these individual voices that function, they're disparate, they have disparate tones, disparate harmonies, but they come together and they work together, and they're greater than the sum of their parts. And it's actually, I encourage everybody to go sit in there if you ever want a moment of inspiration on what our national identity can and should be. But in telling my children that Cardiff's work, this is the installation at the National Gallery, still offers an accurate analogy for what Canada is today, I think I've sold them a bill of goods. Many in Canada would now describe our nation less as a melodically pluralistic counterpoint and more as a ghettoized cacophony. That sentiment flares up most often among the discussion of skyrocketing immigration levels, especially regarding whether Canada can integrate all of the people it's welcomed in the last 5 years. But attempting to answer that question leads to even murkier waters. In 2025, what does integration into Canada mean anyway? What is the value of Canadianship? And that ambiguity belies the actual problem. Canada's sense of national identity has been eroded by this government to the point of non-existence, and immigrants can't be expected to integrate into something that isn't there. In recent decades, successive Liberal governments have used legislation and regulation, like this piece in front of us today, to segregate Canada among regional and ethnocultural lines. Thus, in Canada, in 2025, our country is perhaps most aptly described as lines on a map. homes to tens of millions encouraged by their federal government to prioritize differences over similarities, reject nationhood for globalism, to take from the country before giving back, and to self-flagellate over historic failings rather than build on the nation's strengths for future resilience. Upon reading that statement, colleagues, many of you will have a visceral reaction. Good. How dare anyone question whether Canada still has a national identity? We're a multicultural nation based on the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and equality of opportunity. Canada is the place where newcomers can retain their cultural identity while plugging into a sense of peaceful, pluralistic Canadian nationhood. That's the Canadian national identity, right? Well, not today. Not after this government. While that might be the prevailing romantic notion of Canadian identity held by some of these colleagues that have eroded it over the last decade, it is no longer accurate to describe it as reality, and admitting the truth is the first step in addressing the problem. For those requiring evidence, it abounds in our country's recent political history. Canada's political left has long led the global post-national movement, best described as the purposeful erosion of national identities in favor of supranational organizations and globalism. Former Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau set Canada on a post-national course with 1971's Multiculturalism Act, which encouraged newcomers to retain their cultural differences rather than embrace a shared Canadian identity. The erosion of Canada's national identity was further normalized in the 1980s via the Liberal government's National Energy Program, which deepened economic divisions between Western and Central Canada. The aftermath of 1995's Quebec referendum further contributed to the erosion of Canadian national identity by entrenching exclusive Quebec nationalism. Then in 2000, Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien stated in a speech that Canada has become a post-national multicultural society. It contains the globe within its borders, and Canadians have learned that their two international languages and their diversity are a comparative advantage and a source of continuing creativity and innovation. Canadians are, by virtue of history and necessity, open to the world. Former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government pumped the brakes on post-nationalism during its tenure. On immigration, Prime Minister Harper's government prioritized national identity with stricter language requirements for citizenship and a tougher citizenship exam. Regarding Quebec, it enshrined a key nationhood motion which included the phrase, "within a united Canada." Economically, Harper attempted to ease Western alienation by bolstering Canada's natural resource industries. And culturally, Harper's government focused on heritage spending, on platforming nation-building victories like the War of 1812. But all those reforms were reversed and far exceeded after Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took office in 2015. Essayists discussing Trudeau Jr.'s famous 2015 post-nationalism quote that there is, quote, "no core identity, no mainstream in Canada," often forget that he didn't just say those words. He operationalized them through a decade of socialist-oriented post-nationalist policies. So much so that his fervent focus on abolishing Canadian national identity may be remembered as the most enduring aspect of his legacy. On immigration, the Trudeau Liberals narrowed the age range for mandatory language requirements in citizenship applications, thus diminishing shared language roles in the Canadian identity for newcomers. They eliminated in-person citizenship oath requirements. They sought to erase references to practices like female genital mutilation as abhorrent in the Canadian Citizenship Study Guide, arguably normalizing their importation into Canada. They turned a blind eye to judicial rulings allowing immigration status to factor into sentencing violent criminals, valuing the process of entry into the country over the responsibilities associated with citizenship. They allowed Canada's compassionate asylum system to be abused into a mockery, and thus we have the bill in front of us today. The Trudeau Liberals have also normalized the practice of importation of conflicts from newcomers' countries of origin, rather than primarily encouraging the shedding of those quarrels in favor of a pluralistic, united Canadian identity rooted in Western democratic values. This phenomenon is best exemplified by the Trudeau government's tolerance of diasporic lobby groups' influence in elections and Canadian institutions, while simultaneously turning a blind eye to groups who sought to plant international conflicts and even terrorist principles in Canadian soil. And despite clear evidence of rising foreign interference in elections, the Liberals have yet to implement a foreign agent registry. The Trudeau Liberals have also prioritized cultural and ethnic differences over a shared ethos of equality in hiring and storytelling. For example, they embedded divisive, quasi-racist hiring policies into federal funding for educational institutions. They allowed Canada's publicly funded national broadcaster to consider abandoning objectivity for racialized narratives. And now, they allocate news funding based on whether or not outlets sufficiently highlight ethnic, religious, or other group differences. Rather than enlisting newcomers to help strengthen a cohesive national identity, such as by constructively addressing the nation's historic injustices, while simultaneously celebrating its positive achievements, the Trudeau Liberals actively erase symbols of shared historic Canadian identity from public view. They redesigned the Canadian passport to replace images of Canadian national heroes like Terry Fox with inert objects like a wheelbarrow. They supported activities that established the Canadian flag as a symbol of shame, as opposed to a representation of patriotism. And they worked to erase Canada's founders from places of prominence. Thus, Canada's political left has profoundly succeeded in transforming Canada into a post-national no-nation, free from the trappings of cohesive national identity. And for those who might argue that this was a good thing, they are very, very wrong. What Justin Trudeau overlooked in his Liberal government's zealous pursuit of post-nationalism is that his father's multicultural vision could only thrive under robust Western democratic institutions. Without a government prioritizing above all else, especially over partisan ideology, the safeguarding of principles like freedom of speech, secularism, the equality of opportunity, multiculturalism, will inevitably destroy a peaceful and democratic nation. The proof is in the pudding. Today, in Canada, after decades of post-national, national identity-destroying policies, less than half of Canadian youth say they would fight for our country. This marks a startling shift from generations ago when Canadians fought for what seemed to be immutable freedoms in great wars. Diasporic conflicts now erupt on Canadian streets, hate crimes against ethnic and religious groups have surged, and the once strong Canadian consensus on immigration has been solidly broken by this government. If Canadians want to reverse the pluralism-destroying course Liberal post-nationalism has set us on, everyone, regardless of political stripe in this place, must acknowledge that post-nationalism has eroded Canada's national identity to the point of non-existence. That state of affairs is likely the biggest threat to our sovereignty today, no other nation included. History proves this conclusion correct. For a civilization to survive the test of history, it needs some sort of cohesive shared identity. Without it, collapse occurs. There's even examples to be found within Canada's own evolution in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, a Canadian national identity had taken root in spite of high levels of immigration. Forged in the crucibles of battlefields like Vimy Ridge, peoples of many backgrounds fought together as Canadians, united by shared values of democracy, rule of law, bilingualism, and loyalty to the Crown. To be Canadian, then, was to embrace English or French as a primary language, respect parliamentary institutions, and demonstrate civic duty through collective efforts in war and nation building. Fast forward to today. Our domestic efforts failed to build critical national infrastructure, have allowed our military to atrophy to the point of near non-functionality. Our foreign policy rewards the tactics of terrorist organizations and abandons Western allies in times of crisis. Logic dictates that if the Liberal government continues eroding the Western democratic values that once, but arguably no longer underpin Canada's rapidly disappearing pluralistic national identity, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and equality in the rule of law's application, then collapse is what should be expected of Canada's once vaunted pluralism. Those looking for remedy from today's Prime Minister, the Liberal Prime Minister that sits here today, will be disappointed, as evidenced by the fact that he put forward a bill like this in front of this place and then gutted amendments on things like language requirements. Long an adherent to the World Economic Forum's globalist blend of post-nationalism, the best definition of Canada's national identity the current Prime Minister has managed to muster was this: we're not the United States. His new Minister of National Identity managed an arguably worse response, offering pithiness like, I won't stand here and pretend that I can tell you what a Canadian is or what it should be. That neither could define Canadian identity as rooted in shared respect for things like the rule of Western-based law, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and equality of opportunity is telling. Nor could they talk about the supremacy of this place and that the fact that we here, who represent all of the Canadians in this country and abroad, have the right to challenge court rulings and to set law. And that is a core part of what we do to strengthen Canadian national identity. The reality is for the current Liberal Prime Minister is that his government must reverse the many changes his predecessor made under their aggressive post-national doctrine in order to rebuild Canada's national identity, prevent pluralism's collapse, and to retain Canadian sovereignty. How can we talk about things that are in the national interest if the government can't define what the national interest is? If he fails, if this Liberal Prime Minister fails, the effect will be the same as if he were to tip over that art installation I spoke about in the National Gallery, a shameful and purposeful squandering of an intricate and delicate masterpiece. And that is why I stand here and oppose this bill. There should be no citizens of convenience. If somebody is to be a citizen of this country, they should be able to speak one of Canada's official languages. They should have a clear and demonstrated ability to understand that the responsibility of Canadian citizenship is to uphold our democratic institutions. And how can we measure that, colleagues? Through a citizenship test. The Liberals gutted that amendment that we made at our committee. You know, the fact that the government put a bill forward after not challenging a lower court ruling on something as vital as the value of Canadian citizenship and who should be eligible for that is bananas. It says that they don't give a rip about Canada's national identity, and it reconfirms the current Prime Minister's continuation of a post-national doctrine. You know, colleagues, we have been in a period of time where we have, especially with the trade situation we find ourselves with our neighbours to the south, and we have the Prime Minister talking about, well, we need to have nation-building initiatives and whatnot, but he can't even talk about what Canada's national identity is. The only thing I've heard this Prime Minister talk about is the fact that we're not American. Well, then what are we? Colleagues, there's very clear definitions of what it could mean to be Canadian. Even in Canada's citizenship guide right now, there isn't a cohesive definition. But I think certainly on this side, we could manage a definition that was rooted in pride, in democratic institutions, and in how to maintain a pluralism, how to maintain a multiculturalism through respect for the rule of law. Colleagues, what we have seen through this government is the denigration of Canada's democratic institutions. The Supreme Court ruling this week on child pornography, censorship bills that take away our ability to speak truth to power. These are all things that erode Canadian sovereignty, and they support post-nationalism. There has never been a more important bill to oppose than this one. For people who might have been affected by the small amount of lost Canadians, we had a bill in front of the Senate that would have addressed these issues years ago. But the Liberals expanded this far beyond the scope of what our colleague in that place tried to do. The minister already has powers to rectify circumstances of citizenship. But what the Liberals are doing today in this bill, especially by gutting the amendments we put forward, is entrench that sense of post-nationalism in the country, erase our national identity, further erase our national identity, erode our pluralism, and further devalue Canadian citizenship. Colleagues, oftentimes in this place, we're tasked with the mundane details of program spending or, different types of policy. But colleagues, we have to be tasked and seized with restoring Canada's national identity and restoring and protecting the value of Canadian citizenship. I implore colleagues to vote against this bill, to make the Liberals go back to the table and come forward with a bill that is narrow in scope. There are tools at their disposal that they could use to challenge court rulings. They have chosen not to. But the value of Canadian citizenship, our national identity, is worth something more than what is in front of us today. So colleagues, I implore you, vote against this bill and protect our heritage and protect the value of Canadian citizenship. Thank you.